Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I opened the blinds to greet the morning today, and I saw this heron flying above the woods behind my house. I saw him again when I was walking through my backyard around like 8 a.m. or so, headed in the same direction. So maybe he's making long circles through the woods and the reservoir. Or maybe there's two of them and this one's chasing that one. I don't know. But I felt this sort of lightness at seeing him, or stillness maybe. This sense of being earthbound, but, you know, seeing this sort of marvel in the sky. I feel better than I did last week. Any of you who were subjected to the introduction to last week's episode, I apologize for getting long, getting heavy, and for being in a state of exhaustion where my voice sounded a lot worse than this voice. But, you know, all those meetings I was going through and the existential weight of that kind of big shift that went around everything that went into that episode about, the episode with Edith Hall about suicide and ancient Greek tragedy and my family. It was rough. But anyway, but that was Wednesday morning. I got back home after Thursday, spent some time decompressing in, you know, my own special way. Took that into the weekend. Didn't have any podcast to record this weekend. I sort of structured it like that. I even took the opportunity to get started on the next issue of Haiku for Business Travelers, which I hope to get out in the next month or so. It was good. It was good not to have a lot of stuff hanging over me. And that sort of brings us to this week's show. See, my guest this time around is the artist and teacher, Keith Mayerson. I met Keith last year when he was interviewing Thomas Woodruff at an event in New York City around Tom's great Francis Rothbard graphic novel opera extravaganza. And at the time, I suggested that we get together. Tom backed me up on this, that Keith and I sit down to record, especially because I picked up at that event Keith's massive monograph called My American Dream. It is filled with oil paintings that Keith has done over, they span back over 20 years of American icons, pastiches of Muppets and fine art, abstractions, renderings of Keith's photos, all sorts of subject matter. And I was looking forward to talking with him about that work, about how he sees the paintings interrelating, because he sort of treats them, even though they're full-size canvases, treats them as panels and, as he puts it, a non-linear, non-narrative comic. And maybe talk about what he considers comics to be, given that he taught comics at School of Visual Arts for a long time, working with Tom Woodruff. So anyway, we talked about connecting on my next trip to California because he's a professor at USC. But I saw that he was going to be in New York for a panel this month, so we got together on that trip instead. So the panel, that's where this all ties to my weird zine thing. The panel was for another project Keith's been involved in, and that's the publication of the first volume of Frank Johnson, Secret Pioneer of American Comics, from Fantagraphics. It just came out. Keith and Chris Byrne co-edited this book, which is, well, it's one of the strangest stories I've ever heard. See, Frank Johnson was this shipping clerk and itinerant musician and recovering drunk and maybe the creator of the first comic book in America, but nobody knew. See, from his teen years until shortly before his death in 1979, Frank Johnson made thousands of pages of comics in these lined notebooks in pencil, some of them featuring continuing characters over like 50 years. And he never published anything. Just kept working away at these strips in his home, seemingly never showing anybody, working in pencil, which, as Keith points out, wouldn't have been reproducible for printing at the time. You had to ink everything then. And just telling these stories and making gags for decades by himself, for himself. So this collection, and Keith will talk about the genesis of it, but this first collection, it's going to be 2 volumes. This covers strips from 1928 to 1950, featuring Bowser Boys and his Wally's Gang characters. It's like 600 pages long, and the project's just mind-blowing. I mean, they're long-form comics at a time no one was making long-form comics. I don't mean that some people did and didn't get back to it. I mean, the form didn't exist. And there's gag humor and subtle jokes and characterization and this increasing degree of artistry to it all as he keeps working all the time at home, just making these comics. And it would be amazing in and of itself, but the whole notion that he wasn't trying to get this stuff published just makes it even weirder and more of a profound piece of life art, if you get me. I mean, even that thing I said before about telling stories. Who's he telling? He's just making these comics by himself. And I mean, our present day is all about publicizing who we are and putting everything we do in the frame of like performer and audience. You know, whether it's our status updates on social media or me doing this show or my newsletter or putting my watercolors online or the way people take pictures of their dinner or selfies or anything. It's all meant to face out at the world. But for Johnson, he just kept making these stories and continuing these characters for almost his entire life and never puts them out in the world. And there's an obvious parallel to this in Henry Darger, and we'll talk about him. And I did an episode with Liz Hand about her Darger-related novel a couple of years ago. But like more than once in our conversation, I tell Keith, this really feels like a Borges story where this guy is working in secret to invent the world just to keep it alive. Or maybe he brings it into existence by not sharing it. I don't know, but it's such a strange and monumental achievement that can only happen posthumously. And we always wonder, you know, what's in the notebooks that weren't found? They're all numbered, all these notebooks, but what's in the ones that weren't found? Did he show other people? Was there an attempt at becoming a published cartoonist? There's no evidence. And I guess let's embrace the mystery and enjoy the work. So Keith and Chris Byrne were co-editors on this project, and that's what Keith was in town for. There was a panel about the first volume of the book, and Karen Green, one of our past guests, a comics historian and librarian up at Columbia University, she was part of it. And anyway, I'm just really glad it gave us an occasion to get together, and I'm glad I got to read some of the book before Keith and I talked, because the strangeness of Johnson's project creates an interesting tension, like a third person in the room with me and Keith, even though not all the conversation is focused on the book. As Keith talks about his own projects and we go back and forth on some of this stuff, there's always this strange figure who brought us together by never showing anybody his life's work. God, it's weird. Anyway, so if you've got a comics bent, I can't say this is like a general audience book because it's a big 600-page comic from the 19-teens, in this case to about 1950, and the second volume will go up into the late 60s or 70s. But anyway, if you've got a comics bent, go check out this amazing and strange book, Frank Johnson, Secret Pioneer of American Comics. And do yourself a favor and look at Keith's incredible body of work in My American Dream. There have been different collections of it, I think, but the big one, the monograph, that was published by Karma, his gallery, in 2022. And it's a gorgeous vision into what America could be. And and what art can do to bring us there. I love seeing Keith's art in that book. We talk at the end of this one about my getting to see some of his work in a gallery this summer, I hope, when I'm out west. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. But get My American Dream, or if you see it in a bookstore, especially an art bookstore, check it out, because he does some amazing work, and the juxtaposition of what he's doing, the story that he's telling, and the way it runs backwards in time from his most recent back to the genesis of the project. It's an America. Anyway, as caveats go, we recorded at Society of Illustrators at their 5th floor office space, which is also an archive. Anyway, there's some New York noise outside, and because it's someone's office, there were a few phone calls that came in. You can hear the ringing. That's about it. Oh, and I thought I might post this one a few weeks ago, the same week as my conversation with Brad Gooch about his Keith Haring bio. So I sort of refer to it as something that's going to come out in a few days around the Keith Haring one. I decided to wait, which in this case, discretion was a better part of valor. Anyway, here's Keith's bio. I'm using the one from the Frank Johnson book. There's a more extensive one at his site. Keith Mayerson has professionally exhibited his art in galleries and museums since 1993. His exhibitions are often installations of images that create larger narratives. His long-running, nonlinear narrative, My American Dream, has been presented in separate exhibitions as chapters, and the ongoing series continues through today and has recently been published as a 428-page wordless novel and monograph by Karma. His graphic novel, Horror Hospital Unplugged, a collaboration with the writer Dennis Cooper, is well known among graphic artists and the queer community. A graphic novel biography of James Dean is forthcoming, to be published by Fantagraphics. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Keith Mayerson. So Frank Johnson.
Okay.
Tell me about the project, what it was like when you first saw these comics and the whole Frank Johnson thing.
So I had a residency at the Elaine de Kooning House in Southampton, where Elaine de Kooning lived and worked for the latter years of her life. And Chris Byrne was a friend. He's also a curator of outsider art and insider art too. But he's one of these people who also wears both hats because he loves comics as much as he loves fine art. And he said, Keith, I have all this work of this outsider cartoonist named Frank Johnson. Do you want to see it? There was no television there, and I love comics. So I said, sure, of course. Dan Nadell had first discovered this work, I think, on eBay. And Frank Johnson was an itinerant musician who would go around and perform banjo on the radio. He was a recovering alcoholic, and he was a shipping clerk. And instead of whittling ducks in his garage, he would just make comics and not tell anybody, not even his wife. And so it was just really bizarre. When he died, I guess his grand stepchildren found volumes and volumes of these amazing comics on school-lined paper done in graphite. So there's never any intention of them getting printed because there was no way to print them in their time. And I had time on my hands, so I started reading them. So for 25 years, before I came to USC, where I teach now, I was the head comics teacher at School of Visual Arts and cartooning coordinator. I was very honored. Mm-hmm. I grew up with comics. I love comics. Growing up in Colorado, I was too young and stupid to appreciate fine art. The museum was okay, but really my access to art was comics. And I was the cartooning kid since day one, really kindergarten, in the school papers, all the way through when I went to Brown and I did the daily comic strip. I published a graphic novel with a guy named Dennis Cooper called Horror Hospital Unplugged. I guess I'm back. Sorry, I'm going a long way around this, but
that's okay.
I'm
all about the digressions. You've listened to the show. So.
Yeah. I came to New York right after Brown, thinking I'd be a cartoonist for the New Yorker, and I was submitting 10 cartoons a week, And in the meantime, I got a job at a magazine called Contemporanea, which was owned in part by Italians, and we were the co-owners. So it was a very small editorial staff, and we were better than the Italians, so there was sort of a mutiny, and the magazine folded. And I had this was way back before the internet, so 1989, and I would call around the galleries and ask them what shows were coming up for our calendar in the back of the magazine. And I had a friend who was working at Robert Miller Gallery, which at the time was a really good blue chip gallery on 57th Street that showed Alice Neal, but also my heroes, Basquiat, Mapplethorpe, and many more, right after they died, actually. And so I came there 2 days before Thanksgiving to apply for a front desk job. And the owner, Bob Miller, said, "Do you want to work tomorrow?" And I was like, well, it's Thanksgiving, but okay. And at Brown, I was a semiotics major in studio art, and I realized I didn't have the philosopher in me to be a semiotician. And I love comics. I did playwriting though too, but I didn't realize I knew I didn't have it in me to be a playwright. I love rendering, but I went to a talk with Lee Lorenz, who at the time was the New Yorker cartoon editor, and it was at the New School. And Ross Chas was there, George Booth was there, and a few others. And I said, I got there late because there was a magazine deadline. I said, I shook Mr. Lorenz's hand, and I was getting like little notes on my rejection slips. And I said, "Mr. Lorenz, you don't know this, but it's our silver anniversary. I just handed my 100th cartoon to you." And he said, "Well, I don't know if you saw George over here, but it took him 10 years and 10 cartoons a week before he got his first one in. So I'm not saying it takes a decade or 10,000 cartoons, but it helps." And so I left the talk with a heavy heart in my hand. And I was like, wow, like being a cartoonist is just as hard as being a fine artist, whatever that is. And art was just about, like cartoons, bringing up ideas aesthetically. And I was more interested in rendering ideas than making people laugh. I thought, well, maybe it's just as easy to be a fine artist than a New Yorker cartoonist. And so I saved my money, and after 7 months of working at Robert Miller, and I went to Denver to be with my friend whose mom was divorced, and worked in his barn, and to go to grad school. And I went to UC Irvine in the early 90s to go to grad school. And I thought I would do comics, but I realized that comics were really hard. And maybe I would do my idea of Pinocchio first as a comic. Pinocchio the Big Fag was my idea. And I did children's book plates as if my version of Pinocchio existed along with a real version of Pinocchio. I wrote a bad, Cole Porter-like musical of Pinocchio the Big Fag, and I chose different moments to illustrate. That was my thesis show. The writer Dennis Cooper came and saw it and loved it, and we became friends. That show traveled to a little gallery called Kiki in San Francisco, and then Annie Philbin, who then was the head of the Drawing Center, brought to New York. Holland Carter gave me a big review. I got my Art Forum's opening page, and that was really my beginning. But then Dennis and I were hanging out with my husband, then boyfriend Andrew, and a guy named Richard Hawkins, wonderful artist. And one day he turned to me at a Stereolab concert, and he said, "Do you want to do a graphic novel with me?" I was like, yes. It was before really graphic novels. There was Tantrum. There was, of course, Kurtzman's Contract with God.
Eisner.
Eisner's Contract with God.
Kurtzman on Jungle Book? That's not really a graphic novel, but
it's almost like that. So I did it, and it was really fun. He would give me one chapter to illustrate a week, and I would, like Kurtzman and Matt, I guess that's why he's on my mind, how Elder and Wood would like dance the tango with Kurtzman doing all the chicken scratch and really filling in those panels with their own funny jokes. Dennis gave me the version of his short story, chapter for chapter, and then he would just let me go wild and do whatever I want. And it took years actually to do it. We did 3 chapters when I was living in Echo Park. His agent brought it around, and we really wanted to be a cult classic. And Research Books was around at the time.
Those guys, yeah.
And it was perfect because those were the ones that were in the back of the used record stores, the William S. Burroughs volumes, or the back of the underground comic stores, and they had just folded.
Modern Primitives too. Was that the one when I was in college? That's right. The one that everybody had, that the weird people had on their shelves.
That's right. Juno Books came out of, they had just folded, but Juno Books came out of it, and Andrea Juno said that she would publish it. And by then I moved to New York, and Andrew was going to grad school, and I finished it there. And so it was sort of like when David Lean was filming Lawrence of Arabia, he said Peter O'Toole looks in one direction in the desert and then turns around for the next shot where he's looking in the other direction, and 3 years had passed. But finally I finished it, and indeed it became a cult classic. It was the Publishers Weekly, one of the best books of the year, nonfiction, fiction or nonfiction. I mean, it wasn't even the graphic novel category. A lot of people really liked it, but it was a little too gay for the comics world at that time, and a little too arty for the comics book world too, and a little too comic-y for the art world, and really too queer for everybody. But a lot of people, really loved it. I've had interesting conversations with people who said that they were, like heroin addicts, homeless, and had only Horror Hospital in their bag along with their change of underwear. And it became a really part of the queercore, homocore movement of the early 90s. And so I was really proud of it. When I came to New York, because Andrew went to grad school here, Tom Woodruff, my great friend, and who you wonderfully have interviewed, said, "Oh my gosh, Keith, I should bring you to the School of Visual Arts, and we should take it over. This could be like the East Village '80s, where Kenny Scharf and Keith Haring went to School of Visual Arts. John Basquiat hung out in the hallways. All the cartoonists did painting, all the painters did comics, and everybody was in a band together." And so we did that. He got me my first job teaching there back in 1995 or 6. At that point, it was sort of the armpit of the art school, which was weird because School of Visual Arts really started as a comics college. Jerry Robinson began it with Hogarth, the Tarzan's Hogarth. Jerry Robinson, who invented the Joker for Batman, and doesn't get as much credit for inventing Robin. I don't know why. And it, since then it had really grown, but in the mid to late 90s, it was sort of overshadowed by everything else. But I was like the indie cartoonist who was there and gave it a lot of heart. And then when Tom became chair, we really got to go gangbusters. And I sort of whispered in his ear about who to hire. And we had a whole wonderful generation of people around my age teaching there, and a lot of amazing students. I taught more classes at SVA my 25 years there than anybody had ever taught at SVA. I think I might have taught more students cartooning maybe than anybody who's lived, because I'd been there longer than most people, taught more classes. I taught a sophomore principles class, junior thesis class, senior portfolio class, a synesthetic model drawing class where people would come dressed in costume as like Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter. We would have videos in the background, and it was about bringing life to the drawing. I taught continuing ed there. I taught pre-college. I taught Anime Wonderland, about the machinations of manga and anime. And I taught fine art at NYU for 13 years, at Columbia MFA, Yale, Brown, Brooklyn College. But comics really kept me from getting hit by lightning, because comics are for everybody. And I've had a wonderful art career where my paintings sort of talk to one another, kind of like panels in a comic on the wall. But my heart really belongs to comics. And USC had a walkout. My husband and we met in grad school, and he's my age, and he's Latino and part indigenous. All of his family lives together in Southern California. And so he really wanted to move back. And he said, well, you better walk in to USC. And they recruited me to teach comics and fine art under the same roof for the first time. And so I went there, and it was really during the Kavanaugh hearings where my comics classes had well over 30 people in them, the first comics classes that ever been taught at SC. And many of them were from the George Lucas School of Cinematic Arts in the animation and gaming program.
Yeah.
And, hopefully art makes the world a better place. Cartooning definitely does. I've had students like Nate Powell, who did March with Senator John Lewis, and Dash Shaw, and Leslie Stein.
You're just naming all my past guests, but that's okay.
Oh my gosh. Like so many wonderful students. And I was like, obviously when you teach these incredible creators and when they go out into the world and make the world a better place, I'm a big believer in Joseph Campbell, and to paraphrase him, like Lucas, he said, an artist's job is to tell stories for a culture to understand itself in order for the culture to progress. And I really believe that. Mm-hmm. I brought Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly to USC for a big talk about the subversive power of graphic art in comics. And he's like the guy who wrote Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer a little bit, who was only remembered for that song. Yeah. And for a long time, he really didn't want to talk about Mouse because he's had such a storied career doing everything.
Sure.
But, at that point in the Trump era, it was on the eve of the midterm elections. He was like, I really want to talk about Mouse because we have to convince half of America that Nazis are real and not just cartoon characters in movies. And they live in the United States and they're trying to take over.
There's that generational forgetfulness thing. I mean, it came up in the episode that's going to air right before yours, the Keith Haring one. Talking with the author Brad Gooch about the Haring book, it was partly to write about the AIDS crisis and the AIDS era, because he said, young gay men nowadays just don't know.
Right.
And similarly, on a maxi scale, in America, we had I don't think we really get what it means when there's a fascist attempt or takeover of these things. And, that sense of that's all in the past. That sense of divorce from, what got us here, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm queer and half Jewish. My dad's Jewish. My mom's Southern Baptist, so I'm a religious mutt, but I'm sort of spiritual. But I'm definitely headed for the gulag if Trump wins again, because I'm queer, half Jewish, intellectual, academic, artist. So I'm first in line. But anyway, I started a visual narrative art program. 5 years later, we have 7 classes in place currently, over 120 students, only 8 from Roski. Which is the art school, many from animation gaming, but also all over the university. We have an interdisciplinary minor where we're working with animation gaming, theater arts, and the English department to create new creators that they'll be celebrating at the Lucas Museum, which is opening up across the street in 2025. And I'm collaborating with Lucas, too. I mean, I'm hoping, like the movie Contact, with Jodie Foster, that the John Hurt character on the screen will appear to me as George Lucas and his wife Melody, who will say, like, oh my gosh, Keith, this is amazing. We have to bequeath you a lot of funding or whatever to build your school. But it's already building. We have 11 classes by next year. We just had approved an advanced comics class, advanced illustration portfolio, ideation of visual worlds taught by Ellie Michalaka, who was the Adventure Time world builder, and Midnight Gospel. Amazing teachers. Sam Alden is a cartoonist who teaches there, who was actually my student Dash's. Dash was his mentor. Angie Wang, who created Kala, the Comics Art Los Angeles Comics Festival, who's an amazing illustrator. Zoe Van Dyke, who's also a very famous, celebrated illustrator. Millennials. Yeah. And with the millennial generation, the Adventure Time generation, they realized, Penn Ward, that these cartoonists are better than the people coming up the CalArts system, because they really know how to rock and roll telling stories in different ways. And so a lot of these guys work, their day jobs in Hollywood doing Steven Universe and We Bear Bears, Adventure Time, all that. Anyway, I was at the Elaine de Kooning house.
So it all takes you back to
I was supposed to be doing the James Dean graphic novel for Fantagraphics. Gary Groth, wonderfully signed a contract with me almost a decade ago. And I keep wonderfully getting art shows, which keep getting in my way of finishing.
He is accustomed to, contracts and deadlines kind of stretching for
he's a hero.
Some artists.
I mean, my gosh. But anyway, so here I am at the Elaine de Kooning house, and I'm looking at these Frank Johnson book pages, and they're really good. The 10,000 hour rule is totally right. And unlike Henry Darger, everybody loves Henry Darger, and obviously Henry Darger is really good.
Well,
But
loves is a weird term for it, but okay, everybody,
respects.
they get what the.
I saw him in Raw, the first time. It was amazing, but you see drawing after drawing of the Vivian girls, the little girls with penises, getting strangled by these weird Turks from another planet. And enough's enough,
15,000 pages, huh? Yeah, that's
who would want to read that?
Yeah.
But Frank Johnson, outsider art for me is, people who are not trained in art school. Mm-hmm. Basically, that's it. That makes you an outsider. You weren't trained in art school. But sometimes outsider art, when it's the work of middle patients or the art brute kind of Dubuffet people, it's when you don't, for me, have a binary going on. Like it's all one way. Like it
always puts me in mind of the moment from the Crumb documentary with Charles, when you're looking at Charles's work as he's younger, and then as it's getting further and further, all it is drapery and all this incredible amount of lines everywhere and nothing else. And it's
sleeping on spikes and
that was the other brother,
sleeping on
Max. No, Charles is the older one who was still living with the mother.
Right.
And his comics just kept getting
more and more folds.
Yeah, and there was nothing left. And it was you were losing your mind on the page. Okay, that's
right. But Frank Johnson has a binary. Compositionally he has the binary. I always think of good compositions are like 60, 40, 70, 30 golden ratio compositions. But also in terms of his content, there's binaries. Like it's actually really good comics. And
I was laughing over some of the 16-year-old pages from when he was 16. When I started reading, I only had the PDF so far. Did about a third of the 600 pages, and I was just like, boy, this guy's funny as shit as a 16-year-old. And it's not just the gags, it's the visuals of the gag.
And that's volume 91. Believe it or not, which I want to believe.
Which is another question I have as to whether we should take that seriously as he did 90 of these before he turned 16.
Book. But, look, I've taught hundreds of pre-college kids, thousands of comic students, and hundreds of continuing ed students. And if he was a pre-college kid right now, you'd be like, wow, this guy has something. He has a spark. This is really good. And interestingly, it's a long-form, continuous narrative comic of original material published 7 or 8 years before the first...
Well, created, not published. That was the whole thing.
Right. Created before the first long-form comic that was ever produced. So hypothetically, it could be the first American comic of all time. Yeah. Which Fantagraphics doesn't want to promote like that because
it's so bizarre.
It's so bizarre, and the comics world will chew that apart. But I really believe it's sort of a historical find. The Bowser Boys, which is this guy was a recovering alcoholic who I think probably had some lapses, is about a group, if it's not un-PC to say, hobos who live on the street, who love their alcohol. They love their bohemian life. Yeah. And to me, it really is like the first underground comic, because way before Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers were on an adventure to find their next fix, these guys are on the street and just enjoying their booze and getting their next fix. And it's really a good comic, and it's rendered in ink. Although some part of it is blue because I think something spilled, probably a bottle of something spilled on the pages. And to me, that's historic. And he also, for Screwball strips, I think he's really one of the first for really zany Screwball strips. In the second volume, it's going to be the Juke Boys, and you'll see all kinds of chicken scratch and narrative inventions that he's doing visually.
I guess my question is, did you believe it? Like when you were looking at this stuff, it's like, is this a hoax? Did somebody fake all this? And was this really 1928? Some guy was...
Look, the comics world loves conspiracies, I know. But no, it's totally real. Karen Green has the volumes at Columbia. Mm-hmm. And everybody, respects Karen with good reason. She knows what she's doing as an archivist. These notebooks that they're in are from those eras, not just the patina. It's not like somebody wiped coffee on them or burned them with a match to get the frazzled pages. They're real, and they were published at that time. He even has the graphite markings of a pencil that had a hand pencil or sharpener that you would have attached to a desk, that blunt tip. And there's so many pages. Why would anybody make it up?
I know, but it's still just one of those so absolutely amazing that something like this exists, that there was this parallel history of comics just taking place in a guy's mind.
Yeah.
And in notebooks that he didn't intend anyone to look at. it's
they're
fantastic.
visionary. I mean, everybody knows Robert Johnson, and thank goodness Robert Johnson recorded his 28 songs or whatever that influenced rock and roll. This is a little bit more like Brian Wilson's Smile, because that never came out. It couldn't influence anybody except for what was on Wild Honey or whatever. And so I don't know how much this will be influential for the future, although I think certainly a lot of people will get a lot out of it. But really, it's a parallel history. It's a secret history, and it's prescient. There's so many things in these books that are so interesting. Ultimately, they're caper comics, like Tintin. Yeah. And they were before Tintin, or before Tintin was anthologized in albums in America. You couldn't have seen them, at least the early albums. Yeah. And they're really canny. They have not quite the exquisite Brussels or precision of Hergé, but they go places. Yeah. And he has multiple narratives happening and jokes every 4 panels, that lead up to jokes. So slight gags that in a long form story really add to something. So, coming at it as a professional comics teacher and avant-garde cartoonist is how I always justify my job at SVH. Sure. The other cartoonists, my beings talk to you. I mean, Dan brought in, I knew art, but Dan brought in Spiegelman to one of my shows, and he totally got it because he loves this guy Cy Lewin, who was making paintings that talk to each other and thinking about comics as a narrative on the wall. And but I was like, this is amazing. This is better or as good as any continuing ed student that I ever taught, which is a hard road to travel because you're an adult making comics, which is a very lonely world. Sometimes when they're not published, especially. Yeah. But I just kept at it with the true blue integrity of making art in the first place because he loved it. And I think if good comics are about taking you on a journey, these comics really do it. They really send you into this other space and you really get to know the characters. There's a breakout fourth wall page in the second volume that will come up where the characters are saying, I can't believe that the artist created us and he's drawing us. Without him, we'd be nothing. But without us, he'd be nothing too, or something like that. And it's really funny, but you could tell that just Karl Barks loved being with Scrooge and the nephews, going on adventures, never leaving his home, or Hergé would, travel across the globe without ever really leaving Brussels. Frank Johnson just lived to be in Wally's gang and live in this world and really enjoy being there in his mind's eye. And they're great.
Do you remember Hicksville, the Dylan Horrocks comic from the 90s?
Yeah, I do.
About the secret library of where all the cartoonists would leave the work they couldn't publish. And,
right.
And you had Picasso's Dream of Franco and all these other things there. This struck me as a weird, almost mirror image of that. The idea that there was, again, this guy just, mirroring or, foreseeing all these developments in comics, but never thinking of maybe not thinking of an audience. God knows if he ever thought of trying to publish or not. But
I doubt it because they're in graphite. And they're also in a form that wasn't, there were newspaper strips there is Popeye and, Gasoline Alley and, strips that would go on little adventures, but nothing quite like this and not in the format of this.
Yeah, and it's one of those days at the end of a book where there's "see you next time," one of the characters is saying, and it's but he's just saying that to himself. Right. He's not making these to hand out to people or to publish.
Unless he was Hilma af Klint, who was the great, abstract painter that nobody ever knew of, and she would have seances and channel entities that would say to her, oh my gosh, you're going to have a show in a beautiful museum with a rotunda, and she ends up having a show at the Guggenheim. Or I think of William Blake, who kept making his work because he was famous with the Angels, and so it didn't really matter if he was seen by a large public. But it was for the Angels, and it must have been for him. He just likes stepping into that world. But I think all great cartoonists do that, and I think a lot of great artists do that too. Yeah,
there's still a degree, though, that you think of an audience.
Yeah.
And yet, the idea of, I always joke that nobody's listening to this. It's okay that we can, do whatever. But, I'm always aware that there are people who either listen to this now or years from now are going to find, they'll look you up and come and say, oh, there's this podcast that Keith Mayerson did. And
I hope so.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I couldn't find great interviews with you. I have to do ours, here.
Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah, it's that sense of making art, not even having a thought like that and so committing himself to this.
Right. There's a purity to it. I think with painting and drawing, sometimes it's easier because the output isn't necessarily about having a gallery show, right? Hopefully you're making it for yourself, and the art's the most important thing, and you're enjoying it. And then I always tell my students, if you get a gallery show, it's icing on the cake. If you sell something from the gallery show, it's a cherry on the top of the icing of the cake. But with comics, it's a little bit like playwriting, where like a playwright is writing a play for it to be performed on stage with an audience. Right. Sometimes comics feel like they're supposed to be for a readership. And if you don't have that, and you aren't even expecting it. That's the other thing. Like there was no way to print graphite in his lifetime, and so one would think like he's not even expecting it. So I've had continuing ed students who are long distance runners, but they usually have the aspirations that yes, they're going to get published. Or
there's also today, at a minimum, you can scan it and put it online. Like you do something where it gets out into a world. It doesn't have to be this one artifact of an original copy.
Right.
And it's
you can get famous online now. It's true. I tell the students
there's just this body of work that existed, and you don't have all the books, which again gets us to the Borges level of did these things just come into existence on their own? That this whole degree of
I don't know what happened to volume 1 through 90. I really don't. And then what I did in terms of this is volume 1 of 2, and volume 2 is going to be really exciting. We're going to have original artworks in it, the jig posts as I mentioned, and the latter half of Wally's Gang, which is definitely beyond the 10,000 hours, and so it gets like even better and more in quotes expert. But then what I did was I jumped ahead from volume 91 to I think it's 110 because I just wanted to get through the learning curve. I wanted to publish the first one because it really could be the first long form comic and then get right to the juice. And I edited out some of the pages that were like kind of like Archie Digest. He would have like 1-page gags that would interrupt longer form parts of the narrative. He did have a few historically
we'll say things
somewhat
that were
forgivable.
We'll say politically correct just because it's an accepted term, but things that you would not make jokes about today.
Mostly a good guy though, but like Osamu Tezuka anthologies, they apologize a little bit, but they're actually the diverse characters that he has in the strip do have agency. In the very first one, he had a Jewish character who continued out throughout the series, and he really had very few stereotypes. But I want to make sure just to cut out anything so there would be no misunderstandings.
And no red flag to sink the whole thing with, this is just some racist.
But there wasn't that much of it, truly. And it was really, if you even look at old Warner Brothers cartoons, there was nothing like anything that's in that.
It's an amazing artifact to see. I'd wondered what the editing process was like. Was it essentially just that in terms of sequencing and figuring out, just stuff that was going to break the flow without...
What was interesting is he was also a huge record collector, kind of like R. Crumb. Like he loved like these old like country records and like hillbilly music and also blues. And there are a few of the fine art images or there's just sort of drawings where they have the names on the records that he was collecting from like crazy collectors at conventions. And so I was able to stream a lot of that music. And so I had a playlist. And it kind of helped the music helped the medicine go down of like plowing through everything just to get into that mindset. Like I tried to with my own art is be sort of like a method actor stepping in his shoes. I was also trying to honor his spirit, and I'm not the Hollywood medium and I don't know if there's an afterlife or whatever, but I like to think that if there was one, his spirit was sort of shining and saying thank you for doing this. And so that kind of kept me going because I wanted to honor him and tribute his work. But then I just plowed through the pages and I took out all the best stuff, and put it in the book. And but there were very few like sort of stinkers. Like it was mostly just the latter work where it was getting really good and taking out some of the missteps, taking out some of the gags just for page count and a sense of flow. And then the second volume, it's really like a lot of the full stories, and it's not even I hate to say it, but it's not edited too much because the stories are so good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I wondered how much work had to go in like that, but that's great. Yeah. The again, when I open the PDF and I see page 1 of 634, I was like, okay, I'll get wrong. But then once you start reading, and it's, at first it's just those 2 panels per page and all this, and it's still the laughs and everything. It's like when they're peeping in on a woman, and then they all run away screaming, not because they're getting caught, but because she's getting into a bath and they're afraid of bath water. Right. All these old hobos. Again, just had the. Okay, you got me. I'm busting out laughing. My wife is wondering, what are you laughing at on the computer over there? And yeah,
good. I'm glad you liked it.
It was something. I can't wait to see the hardcover the hard copy downstairs when we finish up. But tell me about how this project does or doesn't parallel the major art project you've been engaged in this century, My American Dream.
Oh, thanks so much for asking. So. Well, I think we're all long-distance runners, like pushing the boulder up the hill. And wonderfully, I have had an art exhibition career my whole life as a professional adult teacher, person, artist, cartoonist. And it was really in the Bush era where the George W. Bush era.
Yeah. Bush the second.
Where I had an art career in the 90s and went really well, but there was one point where I was doing figurative next abstract painting and like more roughly hewn stuff because I come from cartooning. I want the emotion expression during the age of art and fashion. And I had this weird, epiphany. I was showing it at Mary Boone. I was like, doing really good, but we moved to this place on 46th Street, 1,300 square feet for $1,300, moving stuff for the floor people. And something fell on our poodle puppy and killed her, which was so terrible. And then we came back from the vet with blood on our shirt, and these guys who were moving in underneath us said, "Come here, I want to show you something. Do you like this wallpaper or this wallpaper?" And it was this red velveteen wallpaper, and they were mobsters, like old school Martin Scorsese mobsters who were opening up a bordello underneath us. And, we're pro-sex worker, we're PC. But, honestly, with these haggard women who were coming in every night and demonic disco music, it was depressing. And Andrew fell into a deep depression. And I had my Holden Caulfield moment of like, the mendacity of the art world, rich white people, who cares about them? That's not the audience I want to speak to. This is why I love comics and cartooning. Like, I really want to speak to the world. And I pulled all my stuff out of the galleries. I thought I'd be like Cézanne or Arthur Rimbaud and like go out into the provinces and just make my work. Andrew had a family cabin out in Paris with the E, California, near Lake Elsinore. Mm-hmm. And I moved out there for a year and I realized, oh my gosh, like if the people at Walmart knew what we were about, they'd probably club us. And it wasn't so romantic,
I now get the Elsinore references in some of the paintings in My American Dream, by the way. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. And I did it. Well, I did a bad Homer Rock screenplay called Hamlet 1999. Elsinore, and I came back to New York with my tail between my legs and just started making work. And I always tell my students, never pull yourself out of the art world because you need to be very grateful for what the art world is. And I realized at the core of the art world were really good people that were really pushing the discourse in the way that they wanted because they believed in it and because it was meaningful. And the art world, our world sadly is still racist, but the art world is one of the more woke worlds in our world. And it isn't just about rich white people. There's so many different kinds of people who are participating on both sides of the desk, especially with artists. And so it took me like 6 years. But in that time, I teach comics via the gag cartoon for any class because I always think the gag cartoon has everything about bringing form and content and compositions up aesthetically. And
although it did create the huge Scott McCloud controvery as to whether that's a comic or not because there's only one panel.
I got to be friends with Scott. We debated that a little bit. 9/11 happened, and we were living in a super illegal sublet in Soho at the time, and we heard the plane fly overhead. It came on the news. I was getting ready to teach that class for my freshman NYU students, and I walked out into the street, and like a Spielberg movie, there were all these people staring in awe at the tower and seeing the hole in the tower with all the people in it. And I came to the class, I'm like, look, guys, I'm not in the mood to talk about cat cartoons. Yeah. I don't know what else to do, but let's go out and draw this thing. And we went out to Washington Square Park just in time for the first tower to fall. The adults in the park were screaming and crying. My kids were really great in holding them. And I was like, okay, guys, look, class dismissed. Go home, call your parents, let them know you're okay. But that was sort of the beginning of my American dream, where instead of doing Bush's bad paintings, like a lot of people were doing, I wanted things that gave me optimism and hope. I realized it was a whole new era with the fall of the towers, and I wanted to bring out images that made me feel good when I was sitting at my easel ruminating about them, that were about the America of a culture and a history and a land that allowed Andrew and I to be together as husbands, and that would be a great America in a non-horrible didactic Trump way of what really is truly great about our Americas. And that gave me hope. And I realized that, with all my shows, they really are paintings that talk to each other, like panels in a comic and a nonlinear narrative. And then with the progression of them, I realized this really was my dream. And each exhibition of mine is like a chapter in that dream. And I keep doing it. I haven't stopped. Like a method actor or like a cartoonist, I like to step into the role of my characters and suture into their avatar. I listen to the biographies of them or music or something that evokes them. So my right brain is in that space to try to bring warmth to it. I was just quoting to my grad student, Charles Schultz, who said when he drew wood, he thought wood. When he drew grass, he thought grass. And when he was drawing a character, he was thinking of their personality and their feelings of that character. Yeah. And so hopefully their emotions come out. And for me, that's it. I think like comics are really close to painting in that manner. I think Rembrandt was like very much like a cartoonist, like suturing into the avatar, breathing life into a work that has a life of its own. And instead of speaking through Scott McCloud icons, even though I do appropriate my favorites, I have in Freeze LA opening tomorrow, I have the Peanuts dance. I put Franklin in there front and center, who hadn't been invented yet. Yeah. And for LGBTQ, I have Peppermint Patty and Marcy. And for some reason, Lucy was left out. I switched out Violet for Lucy, and I have Charlie Brown as like a Jesus-like figure, and Woodstock as like, so I do quote my favorites, but also I think of the icons of my work are being popular figures from our culture who people understand in an iconic way and have their ideas that those characters represent being brought to it. I do landscapes, from my own photographs usually, and I also do my own abstract, what I call iconscapes. I always feel like if we were able to project our dreams onto a screen, maybe they would look like Scott McCloud's smiley faces, because our mind can't create things better than they already exist. And maybe they would like be little ghosts that you think like, oh, that's Grandpa. Mm-hmm. And to work from my subconscious, bringing out those sort of icons into a more of a figurative way than Gorky would do, and with more color, but not bringing them fully into the stretched elephant of a Salvador Dali. And then I mix them all up in shows. I mean, I always tell the kids, don't be a reverse snob against the art world, like, because it is a good place, but they shouldn't be, high and low is a debate that was supposed to be left, way back in the 1980s. But the weird thing is, in the fine art world, I think a lot of people don't appreciate, especially if they're sort of horses in a stable on a wall, that the paintings are really telling a story, even if they aren't intended to. Like Spiegelman would say, a museum curator is definitely telling a story in an installation. I think of salons as being wonderful comic compositions where paintings are cheek to jowl on the wall, but they also work compositionally. When I was in the Whitney Biennial, it was very specific for me how images were placed next to each other to tell a story in that way, in sort of a vertical way. And when I have shows where the paintings are next to each other, it's sort of a horizontal thing. We wonderfully were able to collect most of the decades, a couple of decades in what I think of as a wordless novel, truly, with my gallery Karma, who started out as a publishing art book publisher. And I'm hoping that it goes backwards from the latest to the...
Because you start with the most recent one. It just came out about 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah, like a year and a half ago.
I was going to bring it with me, but you signed it when I met you last year, and with my neck issue, there's no way on earth I was carrying that gigantic book around through New York.
It's a little bit of a doorstop.
Getting it off my shelf, I was like, I'm going to use two hands so I don't strain anything. But yeah, it struck me that decision to start with the most recent and go all the way back to mainly about 2006 or so. You have a jump to 99 at the very end, but. What led to the choice to start in the present and
I want to start in the 90s with the beginnings of this, the genesis of this, and go to the future. But honestly, the publisher is my art dealer, and he was like, no, you can never do that. Okay. So part of it was practical because they wanted to bring it and show collectors and be like, this is the latest work.
Gotcha.
With having to go to the end, which was. And so I really we had a back and forth about it, and I trust him. He's really great, Brendan Dugan, and he definitely knows what he's doing. And I was like, well, maybe this is cosmic serendipity, because maybe like a dream, it's going backwards, like spinning backwards to the beginning of like the aughts, around the time of 9/11. And it ends with my Hamlet 1999 show where I did the Looney Tunes, It's All Folks, with not a circle in the back, but almost like a globe blowing up. And so hopefully that doesn't happen in our lifetime.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. But I'm hoping it kind of works like that, where it feels like it's like a dream. And here we are now with these great cultural and civil rights heroes and the Muppets and the cultural heroes that made the world a better place, and go back in time where it gets a little raw and a little bit more primal.
That's what I wondered, what it looked like to you, seeing the most recent and going back 20-something years with it. How do you see your art?
Well, in reverse, I tell the students, like, hopefully we're all good at every stage, like I don't mean this totally in a vain way, but like I like to think my high school stuff was pretty good and my college stuff was pretty good, like for the age that you were. I have a Buddhist quote that I use for this with the kids. It's like, supposedly this is a Dalai Lama story or something. A monk comes up to the Dalai Lama or a monk, and he's like, how should I pray? How should I meditate? Should I do it sort of more tight or more loose? And he said, well, you're a musician, right? And he's like, yes. And he's like, when you play your guitar, does it work if you tighten up your guitar really tight? And he's like, no. If it's too loose, what happens? Like, oh, it sounds terrible, or I fall asleep. And so like the middle path is good. And so sometimes if you need to, if you're too loose, it's good to tighten up. If you're too tight, it's good to loosen up. I started out more loose. I started out tight in grad school, really rendering. I had my Cézanne moments where I just, like Pfeiffer or something too, just wanted to get it out. Or like Charles Schultz in ink, and just like, and I would have raw canvas left on that, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I have to fill in the raw canvas, otherwise people will think it's non-finished. And then you would put it in, and it would fall apart. But Andrew and I went for our 40th birthday blowout to Europe, and I saw a lot of great, old master paintings. And I realized the old masters were micromanaging moments in small quadrants of their work where it really falls into abstraction. Something I really like is when you like look at something, like you look at a Cézanne rock and it turns into a whole other world. And it was harder for me to let go. Like now I still do 3 or 4 layers would be hard for me just to rock out and do a painting a night. Although I envy people who could do that now.
I marvel just over it's not just the sheer number of pieces in that book, but once I realized the measurements, I'm like, those aren't, he's not doing these at book size. These are these full size paintings. And it's just, you did this incredible amount of
honestly, a cartoon since I was in kindergarten, as I said, and like I was always in the habit of coming home and drawing. It was really fun for me. When I was teaching here, I was teaching 6 days a week. But when I wasn't teaching, I was at my easel. And if I wasn't at my easel or teaching, I was doing art world stuff or comic stuff. And it's still the same. I live in the provinces now in Riverside. But if I'm not teaching, I'm painting. And it keeps me from, especially in the Trump era, from running down the street, pulling out my hair and screaming.
I will say, and from what you were talking about with the genesis of my American dream, it's now been 20 years that I've been saying it, one of the worst aspects of the Bush era was the amount of shitty art people made in protest.
Yeah.
Not to say I was in support. I protested, but the awfulness of the, yes, I'm going to strike my propaganda point too. I'm like, again, you're pursuing a different angle with this and finding another way to register the America you wanted to see.
Well, and my machinations really come from comics. I really feel like I love the if it's not a bad word to say these days, the populism of like a Warhol, where you're making work that's relatable in so many ways because it's from pop culture. But I also love the emotion and the synesthetic properties of a Rembrandt. I like the have your cake and eat it too plan, where can you make work that's relatable, but at the same time, can you suture in as an artist and not just art direct? Because I used to art direct myself to paint in different styles, but to actually just like put your meditative cap on while you're rendering and use it as a talisman to think about stuff. I like Proust, and, at the beginning of Remembrance of Things Past, he bites into a Madeline and sends them into this reverie of memories. And for me, each image that I'm painting is like that talisman. It's like that Madeline. And I want to go into those reveries and think about my thoughts, use it as a meditation. Hopefully, as my brush is, pointing towards the future with all the baggage of being in the past, I'm also controlling what I'm doing, but also my unconscious is controlling that brush, and just with the same pleasure of a cartoonist suturing in. I always think it's neat that I just did this Peanuts painting and listening a lot to Charles Schulz and his biography, how he really passed away right after he retired from drawing, and the day before his final strip came out. Keith Haring, same thing, was like, please give me a pencil just to draw. Tezuka, same thing. I think a lot of wonderful artists and cartoonists who are also obviously artists live to draw. It's the edifying meds of their brain yoga that they need, and they love being in that space. And in that space, they like to suture in and journey and transcend into those worlds that they're rendering. And that's what makes them so much like magical dream journeys for the viewer or the reader of that work. You go into their dream world and you explore and you feel it.
Talk about Haring a little bit, keeping in mind this is going to air right after the Keith Haring bio episode. You mentioned before we started recording that he was a big, I'll say, influence, I guess.
Absolutely. When I was in college, Basquiat and Haring were both big. I remember when the New York Times Magazine came out with Basquiat on the cover. I was at the Brown Ratty and him in the Armani suit without shoes. I'm like, wow, you could do this. But Keith Haring, also obviously being a white guy who was queer, who came to New York, who also had no problem with his work being a popular medium. All of them loved Warhol at that time, who was actually kind of out in the art world.
And that's sort of Brad's point, by the way, is Warhol, Haring brought the art back to people. Warhol brought the popular images up to the gallery level.
I think that's true. I think that's a really good point. And they revered him. But Keith Haring really wanted to bring his work to the people, crack his whack. The billboards, and of course AIDS. Was happening horribly, and I think he and Wojnarowicz and people like that were had both sides of the candle burning, fast, because they realized that their time was limited, and they realized that their art could be really important, and that he was influenced by semiotics. He is working with an iconic vocabulary of his dancing figures and barking dogs that was relatable because it was so essentialized, and that he was doing work that had a personal purpose. He's obviously transcending into those things, and he's able to draw like a dream. There was a Keith Haring show at the Barnes Foundation. At the Broad in L.A., and he had this giant mural they had done in a day.
That's when you read the biography, it's things like that where it's not just doing it in a day with no plan. There was no preliminary sketch that he went in with. It was just, I have to fill that wall. Okay. And just
I always tell the kids drugs are bad, art is good. There was a little bit of a chemistry that was happening a little bit. I don't think speed, but
apparently just weed and psychedelics.
Yeah,
according to Brad,
I think that's what
the drugs of choice.
But also, I think it was just stream of consciousness and not having that self-consciousness. And I think cartoonists are really good for that because, you're drawing every day to be printed the next day or whenever, and you have to edit out your own editor sometimes, and you have to just like, okay, this is a joke, this is going to be next week. This is going to be one day. It's one after the other, one step at a time. But also I think it was about sort of suturing in and being able to have that sort of stream of consciousness approach, making your imagery. And that was for the people. And, that had a huge influence me on college and in college. And then he was an out gay and proud person who was also political with his work and doing something that had a lot of form in addition to a lot of content. Obviously Basquiat too. Obviously a lot of that world who were and like the Harry Hu and people like that who were like building on Warhol and Lichtenstein, not just as a Duchampian maneuver, bringing it a ready-made comic into a gallery or a museum and calling it art, but using the iconic vocabulary of cartoons to be able to render things that were relatable because they were essentialized, emotional, warm, with form and with content. When he passed away, it was really devastating. When Mapplethorpe and all those people had passed away, but then I felt like, well, hopefully this could happen for me, and I could come to New York and be an artist too.
Yeah. It's that degree of really seeing what it was like. When I was recording with Thomas, with Tom Winthrop, doing my research before that, and seeing the I won't say survivor's guilt, but that sense of burden of being being out and gay in New York in that era, and living beyond it, and what you're bringing with you and what you're trying to memorialize, I guess, trying to bring to the next generations. It's there are aspects of the. Oh, sorry. Go on. Yeah.
Luckily, my generation in some ways dodged the bullet a little bit.
You're
like I remember seeing,
young, but you're still.
I was. AIDS came out when I was in high school, and before I had the guts to be.
Yeah, when did you come out?
In college.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I knew that was who I was, but I didn't take the step, or I didn't have the step taken up. I didn't have anybody ask me to participate until I was in college. But I saw my first Silence Equals Death graffiti on the sidewalk then, and it really struck me. And of course, we were all terrified. And so, we practiced safely and things like that. And I think part of that too was like getting your yayas out in other ways creatively. And then also just the political dynamics of like being out and proud was so important then, as it is now. Sure. I mean, the first day of my class, I'll drop my pearls and talk about my husband and, our life together and stuff like that, because I think it's important. Sadly, that in the Trump era, or the post, we're not in the post-Trump era, but we need
in this era. We'll just leave it
in this era. Yeah.
Talk about that within My American Dream. I mean, you use a number of recurring pop culture figures. You've got the Muppets, you've got Peanuts, you've got certain comic book figures, but you also have a couple of, we'll say, icons of gay male world in James Dean, Keanu, and Elvis, periodically cropping up repeatedly. Talk about that. I guess
sure,
is that a sign of
to me? I'm about to be 58, so I'm a Gen Xer in the end of the baby boomers. And, with like Judy Garland, I was always terrified of her, like most young gay people were, but also like wondering what the heck like the older gay men loved about her. And now I get it. Like she was a strong female protagonist. And James Dean, sort of same thing. Like to me, I mean, who knows
whether they themselves.
That's James Dean was gay. Yeah. I mean, this is a historical fact. Like he was sugar daddied into Hollywood. Like he had sexual relationships with other men that were documented and notarized. Like it's really true. And his idea of masculinity for me was really important. Like he kind of invented rock and roll. Like Elvis always said he wouldn't have been Elvis unless of James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. The idea of being a sensitive guy who wasn't a dick in every way, not to be the phallocentric kind of John Wayne like character, but to be a male that had his plumbing, but didn't have to have his guns and swagger, and to be emotional and feeling and artistic. You know, he really wanted to be on Mount Olympus along with Picasso and Michelangelo and the rest. And he wanted to do something that was new, that was aspirational. And so kind of like Tom of Finland, I love all kinds of queer people. And honestly, how you are presenting, I think, you know, femme or butch or somewhere in between or non-binary is incredible. But for me, especially growing up, like James Dean represented a sort of out and proud, not necessarily masculine in a typical way, but a different kind of masculinity model to follow, who was also aspirational in how he was able to affect culture. Like he really believed in the importance of his work to make the world a better place through his movies and his actions and activities. And so that was really, really important to me. Elvis, you know, is controversial in so many ways. We love Priscilla, you know, the movie. Which
I saw this just showing up on streaming. I figured I have to catch it at some point.
And to me, growing up, he was like a fat joke, you know, because like
same age. I remember when he died, it was the big fat guy, you know.
And then Scary Monsters, David Bowie came out, which I was much more interested in than Elvis. But then finally, I saw the '68 comeback special, and I was like, wow, like this is one guy who, in his colonizing way, looking at the blues
appropriations
and the appropriation and everything, but he also was from the other side of the tracks, and he identified with African American people, and they were his friends, you know. So it wasn't total exploitation, and I like to think in a good way Elvis is okay. But then how he presented himself too, being inspired by Dean, and also Captain Marvel, you know, was his whole look. That's why he dyed his hair and he had his curly Q, and like why he wore the one-piece jumpers was superheroes. And that he was emotional and great. And Keanu, you know, I got to finally meet him.
Oh, yeah?
And it was like, Keanu, like it was at a LACMA event last year. I was like, OMG, like Keanu. And I never go up to people because I grew up, you know, I was in New York for 25 years. You just don't do that. But it was Keanu, who I've done hundreds of pictures of. And you know, like Tezuka had his roll call kind of like of Scorsese, of his Scorsese always has De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio. Tezuka had his cast of characters that like rock and stuff that he would always employ. Keanu, for a long time, was one of mine. And I was like, Keanu, like, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but you have to know that I've painted you so many times. Wonderfully, you would like to know, too, that hasn't been for about 20 years since I painted you. But you were really a hero for me. He was like, why? And I was like, well, because you represented a different kind of masculinity for me. Like, you weren't totally Caucasian, you're part Hawaiian. You were always, you know, before Speed, you were always catching the balls that people were throwing at you rather than throwing them, kind of in a Bugs Bunny way. Like, he doesn't react unless he's reacted upon. And he was really loving and sensitive towards women. And, you know, he let them be on top. You know, Sandra Bullock at the end of Speed is on top and like make the move. And that you represent a new model of masculinity for the Gen X slacker era that has really been effective and wonderful for so many people. And of course, you're a great actor. He was like, whoa, okay, thanks.
I try not to nerd out because, again, I've lived around New York my whole life. But yes, there are those instances of, boy, I'm going to embarrass myself. I got to figure out how to, you know. But well done, well composed. I'm glad you held it together.
I'm glad too. Hopefully he didn't think too ill of me. And I said, I have this book out. You could see, you know, all your images in it. And he was like, what's your name again? I was like, Keith Mayerson. He was like, Keith Mayerson. And he was like, what gallery you show at? I was like, Karma. He's like, Keith Mayerson, Karma. I was like, wow, I could die now. Like, this is fine. Like,
okay. So yes, I thought those were the three majors for you as far as
there are touchdowns for sure.
Yeah. And then on the pop cult side, the Muppet thing.
Yeah, you know, I grew up with the Muppets. I love the Muppets, and I was a right age for Sesame Street. I was right there. When the Muppet Show came out, I was about 10 or 11, so I was right there. the Sesame Street was really created very consciously after the civil rights movement. They really consulted those people, and they really wanted Henson to come in because of his puppets and, the great creativity that he had, but also thinking very consciously of, like, if you're a centralized character and you're purple or green, what ethnicity are you? Yeah. What gender are you? I mean, they don't really have any plumbing. And what class are you? And it, if you think of Sesame Street, it was all about cooperation and living in the neighborhood together. And that really, growing up in the suburbs of Colorado and Denver, cultivated my idea ideologically, politically, of how to care for other people and have empathy and compassion for everyone. And the Muppet Show, as zany as it was, always had a heart at its center. And it was sort of, gender bending too. And, Miss Piggy was like a truck driver who wanted to be a diva, Frank Oz said, and the mysterious couple. And I was chair at Roski of 2D, which was a little bit like the Muppet Show because there were a lot of egos running around. And I had done a painting of Kermit on the Bike that ended up in the 2014 Whitney Biannual that got into the New York Times and became pretty popular. And that was a moment for me in the Muppet movie where all of a sudden a cartoon character was real because there were no strings attached. It really was Pinocchio. He was real.
I always heard they'd never figured out how they managed to pull that off, that shot with the bicycle.
Right. And that's what I hope painting could still be, as a picture onto another world. Yeah. And I love the idea of these cartoon characters being part of a reality and bringing that to the fore. And so when I went on sabbatical, I went back into the Muppets even more just to get my yayas out and work through my PTSDs. And because I love Kermit as an icon, kind of like Keanu or any of these people, like he's sort of genderqueer. And he also, Ernie and Bert are gay. Who knows what Kermit is? Yeah. But still, he was a model of masculinity to follow. And Henson and Associates, like they were people who were making their art that wasn't compromised to really make consciously the world a better place, uncompromised, being able to make work that was popular and not sell their soul for rock and roll.
Trying to explain to people that they did a skit that was playing village peoples in the Navy with a bunch of Vikings pillaging across a landscape. Yeah. And it was like, I was like 7 years old watching this, and this was like, of course, it's the Muppet Show. Yeah. We'll put the kid in front of the TV, and it's fine.
All pigs.
They just completely bent our brains with that stuff.
Fabulous.
It reminded me that years ago, Roger Langridge in England, New Zealand cartoonist, living in the UK, he got the Muppet Show assignment when Boom Comics was doing it, and it was one of those. You found the perfect cartoonist to do a Muppet Show because he just had he got the whole vaudeville thing and just built the whole scene around it and was fantastic. But yeah, it's I'd seeing, especially with the cover of My American Dream with that huge canvas you did.
That was a bucket list, where they're singing the Rainbow Connection and the camera pans out and you see all the Muppets. In that soundstage as like a community. And I feel it was almost like the island of Manhattan, the sort of isolated community of all these eclectic peoples and with the rainbow kind of coming down. And to me, of course, all this is, cartoons are so important in comics because you're speaking with relatable icons, usually in allegorical narratives that are also relatable because they're reduced to a fairy tale myth or a fable. And with the Muppets and like that image too, I was just thinking of all of us in America all put together on this continent, and we hopefully can all get along. And if we have aspirations, if we keep ever hopeful and don't give up hope, that maybe we could transcend this moment and get into a brighter future. And, the pushback of what's happening, really it's pushback, right? Because like in so many ways, our world is so much better than it's ever been, culturally speaking. Like with my students, they have no problem with LGBTQIA, no problem, talking about pronouncing their gender at the very beginning of the class. No problem really with race, with class or anything like that. And I think it's sort of these diehard old non-critical thinking people who want to make America great again by making it turn into a fascist autocracy. So the people who were in power keep maintaining their power at the expense of everything else, but it's also pushing back because the world has become so progressed. And hopefully we'll get through this moment if we keep hope alive. I really think that's the job of art. It works like comics. I think, Scott McCloud talks about how one panel next to another panel is the magic of the semiotics of comics, the language of comics, because your mind affects the closure that completes that gap. And you have to think for yourself actively. I think with fine art, the same is true, where you see a work on the wall and the gutter is the space between you and the wall and the work that you're seeing. And hopefully if it's seductive enough to look at it, and that you could think about it for a long time too, you're affecting the closure in your mind that hopefully makes you recognize and objectify yourself, your own consciousness, what you've learned and how you've learned it, where that comes from. And so in a good way, you objectify yourself as one being in the world of many. And so hopefully we could all get along with everybody, and with that, the flora and the fauna of the planet, so we could as a species survive.
Your American dream.
That's it.
I'm with you. Last question. I don't want to keep you too long, and I think the guy whose office we're using eventually is going to want to come in. What are you reading?
What am I reading right now? Honestly, I shouldn't say this out loud because I don't want to get sued, but I'm doing Space Jam with Michael Jordan. Yeah. So Chuck-a-muck. One
of my favorite things in My American Dream, by the way, is that you got LeBron's block on Andre Iguodala.
Awesome.
That was, but anyway, go. So you're doing the Chuck-a-muck book, the Chuck Jones?
And, I audiobook read. And so I read Michael Jordan's biography, which was also, I love cultural heroes and being who I am. Sometimes I've painted wonderful people who are heroes, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and people I feel it's safe to represent. I feel like no matter who we are, hopefully we could paint people and honor them. But I also really want to do my homework. And so, Chuck-a-muck for the loony characters and listening to Chuck Jones and all the wonderful interviews. But the Michael Jordan biography, I just read. And just before that, I was doing, what was the painting? I read the Charles Schulz biography on audiobook, and my cousin Wendy Wolf, who's a publisher, says it's not cheating to read audiobooks.
I never have, but I figure any way people are getting literature, I'm fine. I'm not going to be an asshole about it.
Right. Well, I read Charles Schulz and Peanuts for like the third or fourth time, which is an amazing book.
Is that David Michaelis? Yeah. I've got that at home. I haven't read it yet.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Some people are it's a little controversial because he says Lucy might be the woman, his first divorced wife or something like that. But in general, it's just really good. And so I have been reading those biographies and things that just kind of get me sutured in. And also for my show coming up May 25th at Karma LA, it's the latest chapter, My American Dream, City of Angels. And so they're cultural heroes and people inspired me to move to Los Angeles when I wanted to as a kid. So Cheech and Chong are in it, Billie Jean King. And I was reading her biography. That's what Space Jam is for. The Grateful Dead, who I love. I'm still a Deadhead. I was the only tween Deadhead I knew. And then the second room are going to be UFOs and national parks. Because I don't know if you've ever gone or seen at Sego Canyon those famous petroglyphs of the rock drawings that kind of look like aliens and spaceships and so on. And we know UFOs are real. The government admits it now, right?
Yeah. And we just kind of let it go now. Nobody cares because,
I know it's a distraction, but at the same time, loving sci-fi and thinking of it allegorically, I'm hoping as a panorama, like I always think if conservative people went to the Grand Canyon, they have to think like, this is amazing. And we want our grandchildren to be able to enjoy this, or Yosemite. And, hopefully that can open up the conversation for clean air and water. And then I'm painting real UFO photographs that have yet to be disproven, listening to a lot of the UFO stuff, like Leslie, I think Keene's book about UFOs. She's the one that broke the story in the New York Times. And so thinking about that and thinking like, oh my gosh, allegorically, if we don't take care of our planet, maybe they will. And maybe that's not going to be a good thing.
It's like watching Resident Alien, that the Alan Tudyk show on well, I stream it, but the aliens are coming in because we're not doing such a great job here.
Right. So. And so hopefully that works just like a wonderful sci-fi allegory of like, oh my gosh. And then you go back and you see Space Jam and that makes more sense and so on. So, and it's fun to paint.
I will probably be in LA the first week of June. So now that I know your show is opening up before that, I will actually see some of your stuff in person, which I'm dying to do.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to meet you there. We can walk through it.
Awesome. Keith, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's really been great.
My great pleasure. Thank you. I'm very honored to be part of this and to do this surrounded by the wonderful archives of the Society of Illustrators.
I'm looking away from you this whole time, looking at all this great art around us.
Well, I love books and obviously comics, and I have them all around spilling out of my shelves, but to be around all this original works of art, I feel like hopefully the spirits of comics and illustration past are blessing us here. So thank you.
And that was Keith Mayerson. Go check out his My American Dream monograph from Karma. Be sure to check out the first volume of Frank Johnson, Secret Pioneer of American Comics, which is out now from Fantagraphics. It will blow your mind once you take in the totality of what you're looking at. And keep a lookout for Keith's upcoming exhibitions. As we say at the end here, I'm hoping to get to the one in California. I hope this June when I'm out there. You should also check out Keith's site, which is keithmayerson.com. KeithMayerson, to check out more of his art, his videos, interviews, writing, and check out his Instagram, which is also Keith Mayerson, spelled the same way. It has some really neat stuff. It's got his artwork and the write-ups that he did about them. They're printed in My American Dream, but way too small for me to read. So on Instagram, he runs those in full with some of the original paintings, and they're really illuminating. And one of the things, I don't know if we got across, but I think we do over the course of this conversation and Keith's tone, is that he seems to be a really good person, really just giving. He kept telling me how honored he was to be on the show, which kept freaking me out. But I realized shortly into it that he wasn't, blowing smoke or anything. He seems really gratified by the fact that somebody would be interested and willing to sit down with him to talk. And he just seems like a good person, and he is an awfully good artist. So anyway, Keith Mayerson, keithmayerson.com, Instagram, My American Dream, and Frank Johnson, Secret Pioneer of American Comics. Now you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with interesting conversations with fascinating creative folks. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art exhibition or theater or comic or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, DM, postcard, or letter if you figure out my mailing address, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me, and messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So go longer than that, just call back, leave a second message. Oh, and let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I would never run something like that without the speaker's permission. So let me know. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I appreciate it. I've got the Patreon, VMS Pod. I've got the button down email, which is also VMS Pod. There's a paid tier, but there's no paywall content. It's just a way of people showing their support for the cause or whatever. But really, give money to other people and other institutions. With people, go through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, all those sorts of crowdfunding platforms, and you'll find people who need help with making the rent, medical bills, veterinary bills, car payments. They might be trying to get an artistic project off the ground, and you can help them with that. There's all sorts of things that people need a hand with. And honestly, my day job treats me fine. My circumstances are okay. I don't need your money, so help out other people. When it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank every month. I make targeted election contributions, but I'm a lobbyist, so that's part of my job. But you can give to, local food bank, Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds, Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice. There's all sorts of things you can do to try to help build a better world. So, I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.